Some progress made in nuclear talks between the U.S. and Iran after another round of negotiations in Geneva. Iran's foreign minister says the two sides did reach an understanding of sorts on guiding principles and will now look at specific proposals in the next 2 weeks. Well, joining us now to break it all down is former Deputy Assistant to the Secretary of Defense, Amber Smith, who also spent several tours of duty as a combat helicopter pilot in both Iraq and Afghanistan, flying into enemy fire in some of the most dangerous combat zones in the world. An honor to talk to you this morning. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be with you.
You know, President Trump made it clear Iran does not want the consequences if these negotiations fail. Amber, we saw the bold action last June when the U.S. military stealth bombers took out Iran's nuclear facilities. I know you spent many years in the Middle East during multiple conflicts. Is this something that can be negotiated? Can we trust the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism?
Well, first of all, no, we cannot trust them. But I do think that it's important to look to Secretary of State Marco Rubio's recent comments about hoping for a peaceful deal. That's the outcome that they want, but makes it also very clear that the preference is for outcomes that protect American security. So we've seen Iran's aggressive posturing, insisting their nuclear program is peaceful, while at the same time enriching uranium and warning against U.S. warships. So they're pushing with the threats when we are trying to bring them to the table peacefully to come to a solution. So Iranian threats will not deter the United States. If Iran wants to avoid escalation and some things that we've seen happen previously, they need to de-escalate with these drills, and they need to negotiate in good faith. That being said, what did Ronald Reagan say? Trust but verify. We know exactly who Iran is, and that they know the consequences if they should ever veer from whatever deal is reached.
Right. And how close do you think we are to a potential armed conflict? And how would you advise the president?
So I still think there is time to come to a solution. But as we're seeing right now with the military posturing that is happening in the region, with the USS General Ford aircraft carrier with significant amounts of buildup of U.S. Air Force planes, and then with Iran's escalations with closing the Strait of Hormuz, it is should be talked about that almost 20% of the world's oil goes through there. That's very important for Americans in terms of global energy prices and hurting Americans every day at the pump when they decide to close that down. So that is a significant escalation, and there is an attempt to flex their muscles right now, but they should pay attention to history in terms of what President Trump is willing to do if they do not want to negotiate.
Exactly.
But it could be if they decide not to.
Right. And, the regime, as we know at this point, has also been weakened by massive protests in Iran. We know thousands of protesters have been killed. Just this past weekend, we saw these huge pro-freedom rallies all around the world calling for a leadership change in Iran, asking for, President Trump's help there. After decades, though, in the Middle East, do we want to risk getting pulled in again? What's your thoughts on this?
So I would say that thankfully we have a commander-in-chief who is not interested in what sort of the strategy was or lack thereof in Iraq or Afghanistan with a significant decades-long war. We have seen that President Trump will act in the best interest of our national security and to protect the United States of America, but he has no interest in any sort of prolonged campaign or war in the region. Just as we saw with Venezuela, he acts when he needs to. He goes in, does some military action to get the outcome that he's looking for, and then moves on. The 20-year plus war that we saw out of the Middle East under the Bush and Obama administrations is not something that President Trump is looking to get into.
Yeah, no one wants to.
A safer region, which is a non-nuclear Iran. That is the goal.
Yeah, no one wants to be in the Middle East for 20 years again. You were pilot in command and air mission commander of the legendary elite 101st Airborne Division. I read part of a speech you gave recently where you said, quote, "We provided aerial security, hunted for improvised explosive devices, and provided real-time actionable intelligence. We were able to find, fix, and destroy the enemy. No 2 days were alike. One day we were scouting for the enemy, and another we were searching for roadside bombs ahead of a convoy." I know when you were deployed to Afghanistan in 2008, you said this war and this enemy were different. You had to engage with terrorists, with the Taliban, with Al-Qaeda. So I know how devastating that was to see that disastrous pullout of Afghanistan during the Biden administration. What are some of the lessons we learned from Iraq and Afghanistan, and what do you wish Americans knew about the enemy, about terrorists in the Middle East?
Well, I will say lessons learned from Iraq and Afghanistan is that bureaucracy has no place in war. Military leaders need to have clear and concise understanding of what the mission is and be given the authority, the technology, and the resources, weapons to accomplish the mission, as well as the confidence from their leaders to be able to do that. War is not meant to be 20 years long. It allows complacency and significant mission creep. And so I'm grateful that we're seeing sort of a change in policy under the Trump administration where they are taking lessons learned from Iraq and Afghanistan and not trying to get involved in any sort of prolonged campaign in the Middle East or anywhere else.
All right, former Deputy Assistant to the Secretary of Defense and Iraq and Afghanistan veteran, Amber Smith, thank you so much for joining us this morning and also for your service to our country. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
I'm Atra El-Nashar in Washington. In Geneva Tuesday, U.S. officials taking part in 2 separate rounds of talks on 2 of the most difficult foreign policy issues, preventing Iran from developing a nuclear weapon and ending Russia's invasion of Ukraine. With global security hanging in the balance, President Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff and son-in-law Jared Kushner engaging in back-to-back negotiations with 2 of America's biggest adversaries, Iran and Russia. For nearly 2 hours Tuesday morning, Oman mediating nuclear talks between the U.S. and Iran.
We managed to reach a general agreement on a number of guiding principles based on which we will move forward from now on.
Iran's foreign minister says each side will now work on text for a possible agreement and exchange drafts at a 3rd meeting, which has not been scheduled yet.
Nevertheless, when you reach the stage to put together a text, things become more difficult and detailed.
Iran wants economic sanctions lifted and says they're willing to consider U.S. concerns about their nuclear program, like high levels of enriched uranium.
I think they want to make a deal. I don't think they want the consequences of not making a deal.
American and Iranian military forces are positioned and ready if talks fall apart. During Tuesday's meeting, a 2nd U.S. aircraft carrier was on its way to the Middle East. And Iran's Revolutionary Guard did a 2nd day of naval drills in the Strait of Hormuz, temporarily closing the key oil route. Witkoff and Kushner then heading across the city of Geneva for the first of 2 days of trilateral talks with Russian and Ukrainian officials. Overnight, more Russian strikes targeting Ukraine's energy sector in the dead of winter. Next Tuesday marks 4 years since Russia invaded, Ukraine pushing Russia to return territory and urging the U.S. to commit to post-war security guarantees. One rare point of progress, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says as of Tuesday, 2,000 Ukrainian children taken by Russia have been returned home. However, he says thousands more are still being held captive. In Washington, I'm Atra El-Nashar. I'm Atra El-Nashar in Washington. Nuclear negotiations between the U.S. and Iran are set to continue in Geneva Tuesday. Diplomats from each country say they're not sure if a deal on Iran's nuclear program and economic sanctions can be reached, but for now, they're willing to try. In the meantime, each side is putting their military on standby. The United States and Iran attempting to keep diplomacy alive with a 2nd round of nuclear talks to be mediated by Oman Tuesday. But if you just look at their recent military moves, it would appear they're preparing for war. Iran State TV releasing this video of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard running drills Monday in the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway essential to oil trade. Within hours, U.S. Central Command posting these images of squadron drills on the deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier stationed in the Middle East, which will be joined by the USS Gerald R aircraft carrier group, the military's largest.
In case we don't make a deal, we'll need it.
Iran's foreign minister writing Monday morning, I am in Geneva with real ideas to achieve a fair and equitable deal. What is not on the table? Submission before threats. Each side has a fundamental goal. Iran wants economic sanctions lifted, and the U.S. wants to prevent Iran from ever developing a nuclear weapon. A key part of that is blocking Iran from enriching uranium, which they've already done nearly to a weapons-grade level.
Do you accept anything less than zero nuclear enrichment?
We don't want any enrichment.
As far as we are concerned, zero enrichment is not on the table.
Another point of friction, Iran's ballistic missile program. The U.S. wants it to be reined in. Iran says it's not up for discussion. According to a new report by CBS, President Trump told Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in December that he would support Israeli strikes on Iran's missile program if a U.S.-Iran deal cannot be reached. Where the U.S. and Iran are on the same page is what happens if talks fail.
This will be very traumatic for Iran if they don't make a deal.
It will be traumatic,
existential,
bad for everybody.
In Washington, I'm Atra El-Nashar reporting.